Yet recording.
Hold on, you didn't start recording yet.
Just missed the 5-second mark.
You can speak a little more loudly and enunciate more clearly.
And I made to check that the mic is working this time because last time I did not set up.
And you have to start with I, insert your name and your email.
I'm Matt Warren. Just wanted to make sure that, you know, as he was saying, who's that room? We should fire those people.
All right. So, who wants to start? Give us an introduction to what we are going to review. Okay, it's you then.
So, this whole mess came into being based on the observation.
Sounds like a good place to start.
Back up. Based on an observation that the semantic surface areas of the executable code portions of VB and C# have more in common than not in common, and that it should be possible to create an abstract representation that spans the semantics of the two languages such that it becomes possible to write Roslyn analyzers that deal with one representation and work for programs written in either language. We've broadened the goals somewhat since then to encompass perhaps other languages that have significant semantic overlap. We're looking at mapping IL to these things. And there's some sort of idle talk about they may someday have some applicability within the compiler. But the stated objective today is to let people write one analyzer that works for both VB and C# programs, and IL to follow shortly thereafter. So that's sort of the abstract concept. In reality, what it is a very thin veneer over the boundaries of the VB and C# compilers. And so a lot of its structure is dictated by how those data structures are structured.
And to be clear, when you say the boundaries, the compilers actually have multiple layers of boundaries, since the compiler essentially produces a boundary and then just systematically lowers it closer and closer to IL. What we're talking about for our operation is that today it produces the first level of boundaries as opposed to the lowest level of boundaries.
Yes, but the distinction is somewhat arbitrary. It's important.
You call me arbitrary and important.
It's important in terms of it's in terms of what is presented to the analyzer authors, but there's no intrinsic reason why other stages of the pipeline, why those representations can't also be mapped.
I agree. I'm just saying it's important, I think, to understand in terms of when we review the API, like what are the expectation of people? Like they're not seeing like fully lowered nullable operations. They're seeing kind of
something that's very close to the source.
Yes, it's something that's much closer to the source as opposed to the IL essentially.
So they would see it using instead of the null check, try finally.
They would say awaits instead of the standard.
Yeah, exactly. It's much higher level than essentially IL. I mean, if you want IL, there's a really great abstraction for it. It's called IL.
So that's true and also not true in that a lot of, like, if you think right now we're doing some experiments with raising IL, and so you have what is conceptually something much closer to the very last boundary before you spit, at least so far in the experiments. I mean, it's possible there's decompilers that can go higher, but for a large set of analyses that we see that like span binaries, they're actually looking for very local things. So like they're trying to figure out like what are the dependencies of this binary, like which like, you know, so you want to visit expressions, or you want to see which methods are called, or the bad methods you're using, different overloads, and like the shape of the trees like from lowering could be quite different, but the analysis, you'll see the analysis API is like, you know, give me all the invocations or something, and sometimes quite often, and FxCop being one of the predecessors to like reporting a bunch of FxCop rules over to this API, FxCop dealt with trees at that low level, and it could still do a lot of meaningful things. And it's kind of interesting that you can have sort of one API shape that sort of, semantically, like there's nothing to say that, the user didn't write, try finally, move next, whatever.
Yeah, the analysis is just fine.
For a lot of things, for not everything. There's tons of caveats there, but but in general, it doesn't mean that sort of the fact that an analyzer we might try to give analyzers lower representations when that's more convenient. We might still, depending on the analysis, exactly what your goal is, you might still get some meaningful things. You might, anyways, just some, yeah.
So on that note, will it be possible to later extend this API set to represent a boundary which is further lowered down?
Yes.
Right. I mean, there's not, from my recollection, there's not a whole lot in the lowered bound trees that isn't sort of part of the higher bound trees. I mean, it's like
There are the enumerators, the async stuff.
the thing. Well, there are method calls in the higher trees, and then there are things that are lowered into method calls in the lower trees. There are variables. There aren't a lot of primitive concepts which exist only at the lowest level and do not exist at the highest level.
There are some
local
sure.
bound sequences, but it's not like
Operators or something like that.
right, but there's not like a huge list of them.
about the stack and stuff.
I think the dupe stuff just happens at the emitter. I don't think we have it in the boundaries.
But if a user is actually interested in knowing what the compiler does, and because most of the time I agree the users are like mapping back to their source, whatever they have written. But if they are later on interested in knowing, okay, what does this question mark dot finally, was lowered into, then and we extend this IOperators or operation APIs to cater to that kind of user, will it appear like kind of yes, it's just an extension of this thing, or will it appear kind of disjoint?
I mean,
It will.
do the same thing at the source level, right? So a lot of the compiler transformations, once it transforms, it's still valid C# code, right? So you can have a syntax tree that the user wrote, and then you could have the transformed syntax tree, right? Uses the same nodes, it's a different tree, right? So the same thing with the operation. You have an operation tree, and then the compiler could transform it and produce a different tree, but it would probably have mostly the same nodes.
So for example, imagine there were a compiler lowering that turned a heap allocation into a stack allocation. Something that's expressible in IL. So right now there's no representation here for create an object on the stack. But so we just add an opcode that says create an object on the stack and an interface that described it, and then you're done.
So I've gone through every opcode and I've raised the tree, and I've had to create about 10 nodes that were just, they had to be like, they have operation kind none right now, and they're my nodes, and they have to do with things like getting so once you have all of IL, then that's as low as the compiler's ever going to go. So I would say that it's possible to represent by simply adding nodes, it is certainly possible to represent all of the IL semantics, and then at that point you can say that if the lowering is always expressed in terms of something that's expressible in IL, then you have all the nodes you could ever want. But some of them have to do with certainly biref things are annoying. There's no way to say right now that an expression is biref, and you can unbox an object on the heap and have a reference to it rather than value of it.
Yeah, because it's not a language notion.
Right. So there are a few, but there are probably on the order of 10 primitive concepts that in theory one could add, and doesn't have to be added right away. I mean, you can add more nodes over time.
And even necessarily, I mean, many of the things that, a couple of examples, like even the biref thing that you mentioned, or bound sequence expressions, which are something that's available in the lower tree but not in the higher language, are concepts we have or are considering adding to C# proper. So, I mean, these are things that today are not expressible in C#, but in C# 7 or 8 or 9, they would be added to the language, and we would have to add nodes even to represent them in their highest form.
In theory, we could get to a place where we have semantic nodes that are lower than, there's not necessarily, I don't know, it doesn't necessarily have to be a syntax that corresponds to the semantic lower nodes. If like we could add those without, I don't know, without having, you know, the corresponding language feature. It's just that if you want to see the semantics, there are these nodes that represent them, but you know, they don't necessarily have a direct syntax.
Absolutely.
And one more comment on this topic, and like before we move forward. So, is it an intent to like? Is this? Can we treat this as a okay? This is a stepping stone towards making analyzers like giving the users an ability to analyze like IL level
Yes.
analysis. So this is like, you know, we have analyzers which are like source level and stuff. This is probably, you know, further down the line, and gradually we'll actually go to like IL level analysis.
Yes.
Based on this one.
The hope is you should be able to write analyzers which can run both on source and on binaries, right? Like one analyzer.
With one representation.
In that world of sort of IL, I don't know what you played with, does it represent everything that's just sort of pushes and pops, or is it higher than that where there's like a method call that has arguments and
The
sort of
main transformation is removing the stack. It requires creating temporaries for, in some cases, because like you have something like you know, push something onto the stack and then you branch or something. So right now, that I mean, it would be easier if there were nodes like push and pop and do for the cases where you're really stuck. Like most of the time, you can just take the stack and put it into a tree, but then like you move around in basic blocks and stuff like that, and then you have stuff on the stack. Right now, I mean, it's still representable, but it depends on the fidelity that you want. Like, right? So the transformation that I've made is just to put, when it's inconvenient, when the stack is like, oops, there's some stuff left over there, is shove it in, generate locals. So semantically, say, okay, there are these locals, I'll stuff them there and then read them. So you can represent those operations, not one-to-one with the instructions necessarily, but the semantics can be preserved through temporaries.
Yeah, and since analyzers already have to understand things like locals and fetches and stores, that doesn't introduce any new concepts to them. Whereas if we add things like push and pop for an operand stack, to the analyzer author, it's like, what the heck is that?
I agree.
For what it's worth, in the compiler, they're represented as locals and temps, and the optimizer decides to make them dupes and pops and pushes and things like that. So they're not even represented that way in the compiler.
I think it would probably. I think the temporaries approach is okay. There's like some cases where I would want to do some refinement where like we can pattern match that something's just a ternary operator, not a big mess of assignments but that's aside. Like you can always fall back to temporaries and eliminate the stack entirely.
And that goes like you keep going higher and higher, right?
Right.
It's the spectrum of decompilation.
Right. You could, just as the tree is getting lowered, we can think about, once we have the lower tree, you can think about having something trying to pattern match and go higher and higher. But
So anyway, that's what this is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's from context perspective probably good enough as an introduction. Should we look at the sample you sent me first, or should we look at the APIs first? Like, what do you think makes the most sense?
Maybe look at just the register operation action, like that API, and then we could look at examples and then go ahead.
Which one? This one here?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we can start with that. So this is an analyzer that's checking for unused fields. So what it does is for a compilation.
So for context, I mean, analyzers generally work by, they get a context and they register for the things they want to process, so they don't have to eagerly process everything. And so this thing will be the new part here, I guess.
Yes, exactly. You used to be able to register for like a field symbol, for example, in the one above, right? Register symbol action. Now you can register for a field reference expression, which is an operation. And so you get like field reference operations. And so you just add them to your hash set. And
Ooh. So is the idea that basically, because I said earlier I'm interested in fields, that I can basically directly cast this guy to a field reference expression. So we'll get every operation that is associated with the symbols I'm listening for.
Well,
that
you know, the field reference expression operation kind down here.
Oh, I guess.
so it takes a lambda and then the kind that you're interested in, right? So there's a field reference kind. Field reference expression.
And the reason that limits at the end we dealt with long ago with the other rest of the API.
Yeah.
We don't like it.
We don't
like it,
but we want to have an alternative.
Yeah. Yeah. So
That makes sense.
and there's register operation action is one. You can also register for an operation block action, which basically is an operation block is kind of like a method or
The body of
the body of something.
Body or a field initializer.
But it's also a block, like the body, the block within.
It's not.
But it's not. It's a block. It's a body.
Just the document method.
Somebody brought that up. Right? Like
Maybe
if I have like a for loop.
Invent a new word.
Yeah.
Well, the reason why we picked that word is because it maps to code blocks, which is what.
You already have a register code block action.
Right. Okay.
I guess it's worth it. I'm sure the API docs already say it's probably worth calling it. Do you even have a term for a block, like a root block or something? No.
Wait, just a statement block?
Just like
No, it's
the
not.
outermost block, I guess, is what it is, right?
It's either a method or it's the initializer expression block.
Oh, that thing,
Or-
we could never name that.
We could never name that, yes. So we just call it
Right.
code block.
We're failing at that for years.
And so since we called the V1 syntax blocks code blocks, the operation equivalent of that is called operation blocks.
Does it like, I'm still not entirely sure I understand. So you're saying that this is the same thing for both, let's say, bodies of if statements as well as for end
It's not.
No, it only means the outer
Yeah, that's
part
what
of
I
a body.
So in this case, for example, it's registering for all blocks, and then it checks to see if the block is a method symbol, right? Which means it's inside a method. And then it checks to see if the method's a finalizer, and if it's empty, then it complains.
But we could have done this without using operations, right?
Sure, yeah, but this makes it so that it works both C# and because if you have to look at the actual whether it's empty, the only reason the empty thing looks at to see, I think if you call conditional methods inside, then it's still considered empty. So it looks for invocation expressions inside. That's the only reason it's an operation action.
The operation block isn't doing anything. Never mind.
Sure.
And there's nothing special about expression body members here. They're just considered blocks, or are they more like initializers? I don't know.
Oh, I guess the
It's trying to
isEmpty
figure out-
finalizer.
isEmpty finalizer is inside is looking for an invocation, and if the invocation happens to be a conditional method, then it still reports an error. Right? That's why
you wanted the code.
So rather than giving the analyzer like the data structure, you're allowing it to say what parts of the data structure it wants, and you're calling it back. What constraints do you have on like the order in which these things happen? Is it essentially like it picked up a random source file and starts reading it from the top? That's even worse.
This happens during compilation.
There is a document, a short document describing the ordering constraints. And except for promising to run the things registered within an action after the action that registered them, there are very few guarantees about order.
So for example, if you have an operation block, now inside this, let's say you register an operation action, then that action will only run once the operation block delegate is called, right? So whereas if you
And all of them will run before the operation end block.
end block is called, but if you register them at the compilation context, then they can all run at whatever order. Now the implementation is it goes through file by file and go top to bottom, but that's not a guarantee. So.
But you do run some in parallel, I suppose, right? You don't literally have a sequence across all source files, right?
So the actions themselves don't run in parallel. If one analyzer registers say 10 actions, then they don't run in parallel.
Manish made that possible.
You can set a flag that says make it run in parallel, but by default we don't, because you might be like storing stuff and clobbering over each other.
Yeah, we don't want people to have to use locks for managing state across their own actions.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Interesting.
So on the
But actions from different analyzers can run in parallel.
right, different analyzers there.
But by flipping a flag, you will call you back potentially on multiple threads. I mean, I'd imagine most analyzers want to do that.
Yes.
But you have to assert it's safe to run my actions in parallel. The assumption is that it's not.
I would say that many people who know what they're doing might want to flip that flag, but most people don't know what they're doing. And probably are doing it wrong and should not have that flag flipped.
Yeah.
It's like people who don't know what they're doing, people who do know, who don't know but think they do.
Exactly.
Those are the ones where you see the little header that says analyzer crash. Do you want to keep calling that one? No.
Yep.
Right.
So, I mean, we could probably look at the actual methods for the signatures for register operation block. And register.
I guess the context itself would probably be the good starting point, right?
Yeah.
Because there's not much that the method otherwise does.
So analysis context is probably the type you want.
And at some point I will figure out how I locate my freaking cursor. What's it called? Analysis context?
Analysis context.
That's the one.
And so it's just like a couple of methods.
Yeah. So the operation methods in the middle.
So
These are the ones, I suppose, right?
So you added stuff to this?
so they've been de-abstractified. Is that?
Yeah.
Because I did notice that there were new abstract methods.
Yeah, somebody submitted a PR, like a community person. They ran into, they were using this, and there was a breaking change for them, and they were like, "Can we make this virtual?" They submitted a PR.
So that got merged.
I see. Because I thought so that there's a whole question here. There's a ton of interfaces, and Roslyn has modified
Wait a minute.
interfaces. So,
They were actually implementing their own analysis context.
so
Okay, that
but-
wasn't the intention. The intention
surprised,
that
yeah.
they do that.
well, so for testing, and right now I've implemented it in a prototype, nonetheless in a separate binary, just so that I can sort of, you can stand up and test and say, here, run this analyzer, take this analysis context and run. So certainly, like, I can imagine any number of unit testing scenarios where somebody might.
Well, I
implement
think
this.
the way they used it was, my philosophy, now this could be recorded, is never design an API and constrain it by what people need to do with unit testing.
That's fine. That's fine. I'm saying.
Right. Unit testing is nice, but it's not the deciding factor. In this case, I think what they did was they had like a wrapping analysis context, and then.
Is this going to help today?
Well, no, it's just whether it's virtual or abstract.
So the difference between operation block action and operation block start action?
Yes. The block start action can register operation actions and the block end action. The block action can't do those things. It can just report diagnostics. And we have that distinction for, yeah.
It's just parallel to the existing patterns that we have for syntax.
The size we should probably look at is then it's operation analysis context and operation block analysis context and operation block start analysis context, right?
Yes.
Look at that guy then first.
These are very recent.
This is very recent.
Well, literally built like 50 minutes ago.
It's
Although
nice
with
that
this
we
one,
were
like
doing the
45
correct
minutes.
It's got stuff I merged in last night.
So it gives you the operation, it gives you the symbol that contains this operation. Operation. And the rest of the stuff is dynamic context. Options, diagnostic, cancellation.
Is operation the term that like the typical consumer of this would use to represent what you're representing?
Okay. The problem is
Probably a well-trodden path.
people who are not compiler experts will probably never have tripped on this stuff at all. And we're looking for terminology that was not compiler wonky. And this is a word we came up with that didn't make people gag.
It also, maybe it didn't make them gag because it doesn't really convey a lot, at least to me. I mean, would it I mean, I guess you thought this through, but would something like fragment or something be?
That conveys less.
Well, we had words that had to mean something like expression and statement, but not imply just one or the other.
We've already used workspaces and services to death elsewhere, so.
Yeah, out of curiosity, is there any compiler lingo that we could have used? Because I'm not aware of any term that would.
Semantic node, maybe.
Bound node.
Yes. I guess, yes.
We wanted to we wanted to convey that these were a word like operation or instruction implied that it was just code that actually does something, as opposed to just metadata describing declarations.
Right. Whereas instruction sounds like a machine instruction. And, Good one question. Should we move this?
Bound node at all? Because I mean, you're implementing it on the
Bound is our language teams inside of Microsoft's jargon. It means nothing to anybody outside Microsoft.
I think operation is a good name.
Yeah, I think it's a good name.
Should we move the stuff out of the semantics namespace, which I invented just in order to have it be a ghetto for these things?
We've had that namespace multiple times, and if you moved it out, then it would end up in the root. I mean, I guess that's where the symbols are.
That's where the syntax stuff is, right? So if I register a syntax node action, I can do like syntax kind dot blah.
No. Syntax node is in the root, but the syntax nodes kinds are in .syntax.
Where's the symbol?
The actual nodes are in .syntax, but syntax kind, the enum, is in the root, right?
Yeah.
So the operation kind enum is inside semantics.
I think all the symbol interfaces are just in code analysis.
All the symbol interfaces are just in code analysis.
You don't have to guess, we can actually look it up.
Yeah, of course, there are like 7 of those. You passed them already. That's how few of them there are.
The world doesn't end if these things have their own namespace, but
I think it's fine. I think just operation kind, if it was in the root.
How about just dot operation?
Good job. I like that. Yeah, the operation kind could be there. Yeah, it makes sense. It could be there. I mean, like you said, like syntax kind or
symbol kind, all of that stuff is in the
those
root.
other kinds. We just don't want, if people are going to be referencing Microsoft.code analysis, we don't want the explosion of iArgument and array creation and all those other names just leaping over the scope.
you get IOperation and the kind enum.
Yeah, that seems great.
So that would be this guy. So you would move this to the root next to the same, right?
Yeah, I mean, I could give a list. Yeah, it would be that. It'd probably be the operation visitors, the operation walker. I don't know about the other kind enums. Maybe. I forget what we do with those. Like, is type kind in the root namespace? Well, obviously it is because
Kind is there. Type operation kind is there. Seems like all sorts of kinds are there.
Just move them all?
Oh no, sorry. This is the semantics.
we have some list of principles here. But yes, the syntax visitor and the syntax walkers, for example, are all in the root because people have to use those a lot.
And then what's
So I don't know if I fully understand. I guess if there's precedent, but I don't know if I fully understand why the root interface would be in the root. Like, not very useful by itself. I mean, it's unlikely that you're going to.
It's
Like, it's unlikely that you're going to have a using and then just use IOperation, but not use any of the other.
we left them there as a breadcrumb. We found that when people were trying to use the Roslyn APIs initially, they did not know where to start. And so when we decided to factor everything into the different namespaces, we explicitly left in the root namespaces all of the basic building blocks that would lead you either to documentation or to like explore them to figure out what else to do. So syntax node, project, document, solution, I symbol, the kinds, the visitors, all of those things are at the first level, or in the language-specific first level, to make sure that you know what the entry point is to the API. But the details, like the actual concrete syntax node types, those are off, like you said, in the syntax ghetto. And that same philosophy could be applied here.
So did this technique work?
Well, no one's asked us where to find the syntax factory recently. No one could find it before. Of course, that namespace has gotten a lot bigger over time. But
Sounds like it's not known not to work.
I can see how it solves, the initial discoverability problem, but then it may introduce new ones. People asking, why same technology in two different namespaces?
I guess with the syntax nodes, it's a little bit easier to get around that, just because there are two different syntax namespaces. One is for Visual Basic and one is for C#. And so you couldn't have all of that in the root namespace, or there would be name ambiguities and chaos everywhere. So it makes very sense to lock those behind closed doors. This is a different case.
Yeah, I'm not proposing that we put everything into one namespace.
Oh.
And if there is like a logical separation between these are general purpose and these are language specifics, then it's fine. But initially I understood you kind of divided APIs into, let's sprinkle, this namespace with few of those, and the rest is somewhere else. And if
I don't think that's what he said.
If there's no rule that the developers can understand why some are here and not the others.
The way I would see this is if you look at the usage pattern that you often have, right? You look at, for example, trees, right? You often deal with the base nodes a lot, right? And so if you centralize the base concepts like the syntax and the symbol stuff, then you basically have a way to see these are the core concepts that the compiler has. And then all the very long, minute details, like all the 500 different syntax nodes that Roslyn has, they're in a different namespace. You don't have this problem that you don't see the forest for the trees. And honestly, in very common cases, you don't actually need the detailed namespaces because most APIs just take the base nodes anyway.
Well, but I thought the comment was that in this case, the root is never useful in itself. You always need the other ones. That's what Nick said.
And that's not exactly how strong I meant to say it, but certainly I would think, does expression and statement belong, because at least if you want to know the concept of an operation, you'd probably be interested to see that there are at least two interesting, very general
We've got one request to eliminate that distinction,
What distinction?
statement and expression.
Ah, yes.
It would really work for C++.
It's all right. I think there's a
the type void or something like that. Or,
Yeah.
There's a clear case to make on not having the interfaces for iCatch in system Microsoft.code analysis, just because that's always in scope, and that's going to start breaking muscle memory with the syntax nodes. If you go for catch clause syntax, you're going to get iCatch clause, and you just have to type more. So I think there's a case to be made for keeping a namespace that those are in. The argument is whether or not we should move a few concepts out of this namespace into the root as breadcrumbs or not. And I
think the things that would be viable candidates would be the root node and the root kind.
Are there strong feelings? Anyone else? Matt?
I could see it go either way.
So that's interesting, the expression. That would certainly simplify the code that I've written if we just had void expressions.
Okay, that would help you.
It would help me, not dramatically, but it would tighten up some code, just as a data point.
Hmm.
Well, it's because you have to do things like, oh, I made this call, and then did it return void? Oh, then I better make a statement. Oh, no, it didn't return void. I got to make an expression. Yeah.
So at the IL level,
You have some ifs that you have to deal with, right? Just because certain, we have every time you have a call that returns void, you have to wrap it in an expression statement. I mean, I don't know. That could be better or worse depending on, I'm not looking at it from the analyzer. I'm looking at it from the provider's point of view, which is not the right point of view for that.
An invocation that produces a type of void is a perfectly valid expression.
It's a valid expression, but then I see. Okay.
But an analyzer author is never going to see the distinction between, they're never going to use I statement. Right? They'll register for.
They might, if they're doing certain kinds of walking, provide some structural guarantees about what is or isn't allowed to appear in a certain point. But other than that, it's kind of an arbitrary distinction. And the specific ask is that F# doesn't have this distinction, basically.
They also don't have bound nodes.
I see. So I guess you end up having.
So if we change them all. If we eliminated that distinction, then the names of these things would have to change as well. Like IBlock statement, IBranch statement.
Not quite that far ahead, but forgetting the names, basically everything would get the characteristics of expression. And I don't know if we want to start looking at the interfaces right now.
I guess this tightens it, like the statement distinction tightens it in terms of what can, like, because if you have a block with statements, like, well, it's like, do you want to allow, like, just, the shape of the tree would start to allow things like, well, I guess we have expression statements, so you can always stuff it in the statement.
But it does have one expression statement for F#, right?
But you will not today encounter 3+ switch.
Right.
That's structurally forbidden.
But there's
We don't want to have that design discussion here per se.
I think it's probably fine.
there's a bit of an eroding thing there with language versions as well. I mean, the C# gets more expression types of things. How do you model assignment things, operations? Because there are statements in Visual Basic and assignment expressions in C#.
They're expressions.
Okay, and you just adapt them or whatever on the VB side.
Wrap an expression statement around it.
Right. That seems fine, actually. Take back what I said earlier. Sure.
So maybe helpful if we look at the key nodes, but let's finish the context node.
Yeah, should the operation block context have a compilation? I forget, does the code block context have compilation? Code block analysis context. A semantic model.
Oh, right, and from that you can get the compilation. So you probably ought to add the compilation of
We should
open.
add compilation to
Add it to both of them.
block and block start.
And also add it to the syntax, to the code blocks ones, just because it looks weird to have a property available from one and not the other, even if you can get to it with one option.
So which one do you want to add? Like the syntax you said?
That's I'll go do it from this comment anyway. But if you want to annotate the
It's unrelated, it's fine. The other question I think came up, like, why is this a class and not a struct? Is the other ones are all structs?
It's an object, meaning
it's abstract. We made them all the ones that could be structs.
never noticed that.
I think even code block is this way.
When the context is just data, it's a struct. When the context has a register,
Yeah,
it's a class. That's what
it's
it's
a register. It needs to store the delegates. It needs to have different implementations for storing.
So it's an abstract type, and therefore it has to be a class.
You kind of solved it here by passing in the delegates that actually represent those methods, I guess, right?
Well, no, like those things don't register anything, right? Those the operation block start block analysis context just gives you a bunch of data. That's it. And the report diagnostic is just
It's
you do a
back,
diagnostic.
if I'm not mistaken, it's backed by a func or something.
That's what I meant. So you pass in basically like the action in basically, right? I mean, you could do it here, just at some point it becomes ridiculous, right? If you have to pass in 1,500 things. At that point you invent JavaScript.
So this pattern's already entrenched. I mean, so
Hash JavaScript.
It seems like
Key value pairs, right?
I would say if this whole API was new, we could talk about maybe we should make, like, not have some things be structs with funcs and some things be abstract classes, but if there's a very clear pattern between, like, that's being mirrored from the syntax to the operations. So.
Well, I thought it didn't, but try to make it data set, right? It was
No,
just
I know.
option.
I'm saying that I think that would have been an interesting, thing to, but consistency seems like important.
suppression info.
So we started IOperation and then walk our way up, I guess, or down, depending on how you look at the tree. So what does is invalid mean? That's interesting. Does it mean you have compiler errors, or does it mean that there's some other bogus representation that you can't have?
Unfortunately, the dot comments got stripped.
Yeah, the tool doesn't show that.
It means there's something in the thing that is suspect. In theory, you could have something that has a compilation error and is not invalid because the thing itself was fine, but there was some language rule that it ran afoul of. There are certainly things that are invalid that don't have compiler errors because a thing it depended on had an error.
Is this mapped to a particular concept in the boundaries?
Yeah,
Has errors or something like that? Or?
something like that. But it's not meant to
How
imply.
does the consumer use it?
The consumer uses by looking at it and saying,
Give it a free
something
pass if it's invalid?
well, it's actually a little weirder than that. There's an analyzer that Sri was writing that was going to complain if you didn't have something within your method. But if you have something invalid within the method, it turned out sometimes the invalid thing was trying to be the thing you were looking for.
It aspired to be that.
And so you didn't want to complain about its absence if you had an invalid thing. So if you want to code in a way that is resilient to not spewing gibberish in the presence of compilation errors.
And we do.
So it's a property that has kind of a fuzzy definition, but you use it sometimes to avoid adding diagnostics, adding more noise when things are potentially incomplete at the time.
Yeah.
It could mean that it either has a compiler error or a subtree has some errors.
So, for example, a member access off of an error type, would that be not valid?
Highly likely that is invalid.
Okay. In that case, for cascading errors, that's a very valuable concept to have because.
Basically, my question was the same. So basically, the idea for the analyzer is you should probably ignore operations that are invalid because whatever conclusions you come to, they're highly likely incorrect. Or
Would you choose to, let's imagine you didn't expose that property, but it was known internally in the implementation. And if you came along and were to report and the diagnostic could be like, oh, well, there's invalid stuff in the area we're looking at, so we'll just ignore what you said.
Well, but that's not necessarily valid because, for instance,
You mean it's invalid?
let's say your analyzer was going to complain if you had any method calls inside of a method that had some attribute. It says, I promise not to call anything. And so you have a method call that is invalid, but it's recognizably a method call. It's still legitimate to complain about that.
So as always, the answer is it depends.
The answer is always it depends.
You try something out, you change it, it feels
It's like, well, like anything you observe about this should be correct because there's nothing surprising under this node. Like, it's like,
I'm just saying, I think we can just say that we can't unilaterally make a decision for you when the truth is the user experience isn't as cut and dry, and every case is slightly different.
Now, on syntax, we have the ability to, we can tell you if it has diagnostics, and you can get those diagnostics. Is there any further way to inspect what the compiler might have said was wrong with it, if it had said anything was wrong with it, to get those diagnostics out?
No. And
Should there be?
I'm not even going to promise that the compiler has run the thing that would produce the diagnostics.
Right, you just know that the bound nodes don't like themselves right now.
Yeah.
They're questionable when they were constructed.
what if they like themselves? So there's an operation kind on none where they kind of don't necessarily dislike themselves, but don't have kind of strongly typed ways to understand what they mean?
Tripping on something with an operation kind of none usually indicates that we've made a mistake.
Right. I think so. Yeah. It's just like we haven't represented some bound node in the IOperation tree.
Which I think I just found one for like stack alloc or like, but like there are a few.
And Gen recently made a change where up until last week you could register an action for an operation kind of none and have it get run on things
that currently didn't have valid operation kinds.
That won't happen anymore.
Do we have bad expression in here? Bad expression.
No, it'll be an expression of some kind that is invalid. The bound bad one probably has an operation kind of none.
I think it's an invalid expression and valid statements. We have both of those in our
We have an operation kind for them? Okay, then the answer to your question is yes, and I should shut up.
The invalid property is a bound bad general.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's really, really bad Star Wars reference.
Yeah, bound bad.
So from a user's perspective, invalid basically means that you cannot successfully compile this, right?
There's something about it that's funky.
And there's like, even if, for example, you have like a invocation expression and it says it's invalid, now you don't know if it's an invocation anymore because it could be like a index property access, right? Because we couldn't bind it, so we can't guarantee that this is a method. So it would be marked invalid.
Basically saying that this whole syntax is invalid program, but we are continuing to analyze it. We're just telling you that this may be invalid.
Well, that's generally like, if you have something that's going to dig further into the tree, usually, if I were using this would be the point where I would stop. Like, I might say something about the surface level of this thing, but I wouldn't take for granted anything within this node. I would stop my analysis at that point, because otherwise there'd be dragons down below somewhere, and your analysis may blow up if it's making assumptions about some correct state of the program.
What you get at this point is whatever the compiler has left behind.
Forensics.
Couple questions here, and sorry, I want to go back up one in just seconds. I missed it. For this one right here, is invalid. That name feels wrong to me. Should it be is valid? Like, it feels like it's we try to avoid negative names in the framework design guidelines and like go for positive names.
Where do you see that is invalid?
It's highlighted.
So the guidelines that we have, technically they say, I'm not sure how I feel about the guideline, but it says that the default value of a field should be the default value of the type.
I thought we had guidelines saying that we should prefer positive names instead of, like, positive conditional names instead of negative.
Yeah, I think invalid is borderline. I think the property would have been named is not valid. I would really
that'd be awesome.
Like, I think double nots are bad. Like, invalid is almost like a.
I think there might be an argument for it just based on the description that, like, when it's true, we're like, you can totally trust this, but it seems like we were like more like, so being valid is like something that we're sure of. It's like, but like invalid was harder. I know it's this doesn't make perfect sense. Like,
there is actually difference in meaning.
Yeah.
You may be able to answer a question whether something is invalid, but not whether it's valid.
And also, since this is kind of, I mean, there is context here. This is people who are used to dealing with syntax nodes who are now dealing with IOperation. Like, we use has errors and syntax nodes, and then we go over here and it's is invalid. I mean, is there any reason like has errors wouldn't work here?
Yes. You weren't listening, were you?
No, I tell you,
Because it may not necessarily.
Jared's an idiot. That's okay.
No, it may be in some invalid state, but not represented by having an error per se.
Right, and the whole point of this API is to make errors, and there's no ordering.
Going up one, argument matching parameter. Why isn't it get argument matching parameter?
Ooh. So which one? I'm not seeing it. This one here?
we didn't do everything above it. We started at IO.
He's just trying to divert discussion away.
Well, I thought we were going straight down, and I thought I'd fallen asleep. Apparently, I hadn't fallen asleep too as long as I have. Where are we now?
So object creation expression is not a type of invocation. There's no unifying thing about.
Yeah, that is
Observation.
I haven't decided whether that's a bad thing or not.
I haven't even decided what you said yet.
Right. It looks like there are aspects of a new operation that are similar to an invocation, such as an argument list, a symbol that's being targeted, the mapping between arguments and parameters, and I don't know whether that should be reflected here with some common interface.
It could be like we have this for the operators. It could be like I actually implemented it this way, but for IL, just have a has arguments node for the common things, but because there are some common, there are some commonalities, right? Like,
But it isn't actually an invocation.
so we could have I has arguments, which just has, so instead of having constructor arguments, it would just be arguments, and then argument matching parameter would go on that, so that that way you could at least, I don't know that the consumer would care much. It is a convenient way to implement it in some case, at least one case. Yeah.
It's certainly worth thinking about. So deserves a note, I guess. Okay.
Still not entirely sure I understand what the feedback was, but
Consider introducing an I has arguments. Shared by object creation and invocation and maybe something else.
I have a question. Many of these types, they need to be interfaces because I see you multiple inherit from them.
All of them have to be interfaces.
Why?
Because we have two languages and they have their own hierarchies. I mean, it's Visual Basic and C#, and so every one of these maps to
diamond pattern.
yes, completely different nodes that aren't even public in different.
So, for example,
libraries.
something like I method binding expression, why does it need to be an interface?
Because it's implemented by a bound node in the compilers.
That has its own hierarchy, right? The two hierarchies are then they need to both be surfaced as. You can't steal their
So
base.
you're saying there's some other hierarchy of classes, pre-existing classes, and these interfaces are implemented by those.
Yeah, there's the pre-existing internal implementation of the compilers that represent the bound trees, and these are just grafted onto them at zero cost because they're interfaces.
So that actually raises something that I made the mistake of not thinking about enough in the Roslyn API, which is at runtime, at debug time, when people are inspecting these in the debugger, they're going to see the concrete types. They're going to see whatever the language-specific nodes are.
Yes, right.
Does discrepancies, if I'm looking at interfaces and they say one set of things, and I'm looking at things in the debugger and they're using different names or different concepts, is that a confusing? That's confusing. I'm just going to concede that. It's confusing.
That is a problem with the VS debugger.
That is fair. We do own that.
well, to be fair, you could do like the debugger type proxy thing on all these guys, right? And you can come up with
You do that on the interface?
well, you can do it on the bound trees, right? But
I see the bound tree.
you would basically sacrifice.
But then you.
Well,
Yeah.
That
No,
doesn't help.
interfaces can't have debugger type proxies. It always the choice, and you wouldn't want it to have a debugger type proxy because you would want to have a debugger type proxy based on the implementation. For instance, there's two implementation IOperation. You probably want two type proxies, one for C# and one for F#.
We should just say __ bound object. That was a comm joke, people.
Laugh. __ canon. That's what you really need. The canonical type.
Oh yeah.
That's the one to see in the debugger.
That's a thing.
So going back to generic state matching parameter, that's a method, right? So should it be?
Yeah. Jared's point was valid.
You want to add a node for that?
It should be
Sorry, I didn't hear.
system dot ha 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 ha. You'll never see this.
I think it's also then I push that upon John to just go through and change all the bound nodes to
You can't
match
tell the bug with like
the namings of the interfaces.
You would kill me,
It's just a rename.
or Neil would.
Jared.
What would I do? I'm the bad person.
I know.
but that's okay.
I'm saying now to make them match, since the bound nodes aren't even public, we'll just go rename their internals to match these namings.
And I suggested someone would kill me if I tried to do that.
Like
It wouldn't be the first time.
You're hanging very high. Okay, fair enough.
I might like take a baseball bat to your computer to stop you, but
No, John, no.
There was also a comment that
He's a computer.
is invalid was valid.
That
It would be really weird if it had a valid, because that's sort of the default.
aren't all these properties valid?
Da-da-da-da.
So, one more question, like syntax I think is optional, correct?
So that's the thing. Syntax is optional when you think about raising from IL.
It's not.
No, I'm curious, why do you say it's
How would
not?
it not be if you're raising from IL? Because, I mean, if you look at how, if we think about this in terms of there's other cases where Roslyn has APIs which are meant to be essentially hosted by non-C# VB languages, and that's workspaces. And in that cases, we do have the breakdown of you get to a point where syntax isn't supported when TypeScript hosts workspaces. And we have patterns for identifying that, and I'm wondering if we have to have the same pattern here to say that there's just no representation at this level.
But there always is a representation.
Okay?
If you don't provide some representation for syntax node here, then analyzers will have no way of getting location information to report things.
But if that's important, I would say that should we be surfacing, if location is the thing that we absolutely have to have, should we be surfacing location and syntax as separate items?
Well, we had 3 days ago, I would have said we should have location and get rid of syntax. And after a certain amount of discussion, it turns out there's value in having the syntax be the thing you use to get the location, because sometimes you can use it to get much more precise location information for what you want to report than if all you had was the location for the operation.
Right, but I'm saying, is there value in having both? Saying, here's the syntax for people who care about it, but that can be optional, but the location is a fundamental requirement.
Otherwise, we would have to fake syntax.
Like, what do you, let me imagine that I'm writing IOperation for IL. What do I return for syntax?
Right now,
You produce it. Null's not a good answer.
Right.
You provide a syntax node whose location is like the whole method body,
Okay.
and the thing says, basically, I'm a method body. And that's the most precise location information you get.
So like the thing is like, so I have locations for individual instructions from the PDB, but like, so I have sequence points, so I can put locations with expressions, but I don't, we can have syntax nodes that all say, you know, I was this opcode or something, I don't know, or they're completely opaque except for a location, but syntax's node is like, you know, it's certainly valid to have it like that.
So does
That's what we're
syntax apply
deciding.
kind, by the way, or is the kind in technical syntax no, because it's language agnostic?
Kind is a mean. Sorry, what was the question?
So syntax no, does it have a typed kind, or is it assumed to be an int because VB has its own?
It's an int.
It's an int.
So you can't have an IL syntax node that doesn't collide with the kinds that C# and VB would have. So you could fake up a meaningful syntax node. But I would agree with Nick. It seems, I don't know, it seems more logical to me to say you always have a location. It may be, you know, it may not make sense in some cases. It may be very broad. But you always, I mean, given that you have, for example, PDBs, you can probably distill more precise information
Sometimes.
without necessarily having to fake up syntax.
Sometimes the location won't be very good either. A lot of the time it won't be very good either.
But at the point where you're faking it up, right?
Well, it's fine to fake it up. If that's a design decision, I don't think it's blocking.
Right. I mean, it's really a question of, do we want people to just carefreely dot into this property, which right now they can do. And in our bound trees, we made a decision to always have that property be non-null. Now, on fairness, we're compiling from source, so we can find something to put in there. The compiler devs thought it was very important to know that that was never going to be null.
To be fair, you also have syntax node where certain properties are null, and there's nothing that would tell me that that's the case.
Those are given implementations, though. What if instead of having syntax node there, you had another interface called IOperation with syntax, or IS syntax, and it just exposes that property, and so it's a little bit more awkward to get to, but.
What's the analyzer out there supposed to do?
Okay, yeah.
You're supposed to not be looking at syntax. That's the whole point of using this API.
Well, but
I just think
the location they need to.
Oh, no, they would have a location property or a location function or something.
And if you want more specific location at that point, you go through this interface to get the syntax and then
Yeah.
I mean, consider an analyzer, right, that wants to provide high fidelity. What you can do is you can say, okay, I will look at the syntax. I will special case C# because I like C#. And on special case VB or whatever else is there because I don't care. And if it's not C#, I just use the location information and burn that in. If it's C#, then I try a bit harder to find a more specific location. I think that would not be a bad design.
Well, I think that's the behavior we want to discourage.
Well, but do you? Because you would, let's say, to me, it's more like a pay-for-play thing at this point, right? I mean, you can always provide some information.
I don't think it's a question of discouraging. It certainly should be. I don't see why it shouldn't be possible when it's available, right? So, yeah. I think it's more a question of just like there are some the very, very, very common cases getting the location, because you can do a lot without ever looking at the syntax. But the fact that if there is one, you should be able to get it. That's also very valid to me. Like it just means that when the analysis can light up on the availability and be like, oh, I need it to handle this case. And that's fine. So I don't know.
What's the relationship between IOperation and fixers? So if I provide something, then I just tie them together by basically registering and diagnostic, and then somebody else listens for that, and that's how I So I don't have to use the syntax at all, even in that case.
Well, like the analyzer would report a diagnostic at a particular location,
yep.
Right? And the fixer would apply at that location. So,
but it is, let's say, I could have my diagnostic provider treating IOperations, not having to know it's C# VB or whatever. So it can provide a diagnostic in all cases.
Yeah.
And then I only provide a C# fixer, in which case I will never get called for the VB case, so I never have to know it. I see.
So we have another language agnostic abstraction over rewriting syntax trees. That's the editor API. So the pit of success should be people getting the most value for the code that they write for the .NET, all of the stuff. We want that to be the pit of success. By default, people are hitting up all of our languages, if at all possible. If we were just going to make an API where they could just only concern themselves with one thing, they could just party on the syntax all day. We have that.
Right, but what are you saying then? Are you saying you should just have location?
No, I'm just speaking to like this repeated scenario of, well, if I only care about this language, then that. Well, this is not the API for the I only care about this language scenario. This is the API for the I thought I only cared about that language, but oh my god, it works for the other stuff too.
Only care, like even FxCop would try to figure out sometimes, would do most of the analysis, and then it would try to find a breadcrumb to figure out that it was actually VB and make an affordance, some whole special case, some sort of. Like you want that hatch if it's available to you. I don't think that.
Oh, I agree that you should have the hatch. I just think that the API should lead you down the path of not taking hard dependencies on what language you're analyzing.
So what recommendation are you making now?
I do think we should expose location, but I also think that it's great to have a syntax property, and that it just.
You're recommending that there be two properties.
Yes, there are two properties.
And syntax is optional or not?
And syntax is optional. What's funny is, like, I think if we have the IL stuff out of the gate at first, we're going to see one set of usage patterns that all people are analyzing is VB and C#. If we had VB, C# and IL, I think that people learning this API would have a different set of usage patterns because of IL not having syntax.
If there is a syntax property, I would strongly encourage any implementation to provide some non-null value for it.
In which case it's moot whether it's, well, maybe it only helps then to have two because it draws attention to because if you're going to fake it up, what do you think you're going to return for location? Like the thing that's right next, like, so, exactly. I mean, if we have to fake it up either way, I don't care. It's certainly if we decide we don't have to fake it up, then it makes it easier not to just return the location. But
talking of that pit of success, right? Like if you want to write an analyzer and you want to run it against IL, and if you just if you cannot just dot into dot syntax dot get location, right? And let's say you do that for C#, right, and it works. Now you run it on IL and it crashes because syntax is null. You don't want that situation.
That would be very disappointing.
Be disappointing.
It'd be better if as we raise IL, you just fake up something so that.
But what do you do in the syntax case? That's my question.
Well, you make some.
I mean, like in the syntax tree case, there are cases where, yeah, if you didn't put in the keyword, you fake one up and say this why it's missing. But there are some cases where things are truly optional, in which case these things are not. So if I only have to run on code that always provided that, I will never crash. And if I got one on code that didn't provide it, now I get an error. So
But there are nulls in the tree, is what you're saying.
that's basically what I'm trying to say. Like, I mean, the question is, what general mechanism do you have? You just put in the document.
There are only no nulls in the tree when it's known from the language, like beforehand, that is an optional element. If it's something that the user just failed to type but is required by the language, then we fake that up, because people should always assume that there's an argument list on something.
Sure.
And so it's only if somebody's like, oh yeah, in C#, I just don't have to have that entire clause there, and so it may not be there.
And your argument is that because people program in that language, it's very intuitive to them what is.
And it's a specific case as opposed to this being the base interface for like the entire concept.
I guess, does compilation unit have a null parent? Anyway, ignore that. It works out most of the time. But we can fake up a node. There's no problem with faking up a node. We'd have to fake up a tree. We'd have to fake up a node and a tree. We can make a singleton fake node and tree for IL, and that would just be the IL node and tree.
Well, it couldn't be a singleton, right?
One for every location. You still have to create one for every location. So it's definitely overhead. Certainly the simplest thing is to say that.
Ouch.
You can make it lazy to be fair, but yes. I mean,
Well, it can just be all the things that are not the location are just going to return constant things. So it's just, it could be the location, and it could maybe even.
Okay, so if we're doing an IL program analysis, that means that for every operation, there's a location, and that is wrapped by a fake node that we allocate. And those fake nodes hopefully all point to the same fake tree, or they point to different fake trees, and so they're just.
You need to be. So this is the thing. Like, are you going to do anything with this tree other than like
Access
get the locations? That's what it's for. From in the, like, yeah.
Right, but the tree can't be null. That's all I'm saying.
Can there be? Like, I don't know the syntax API very well, so you guys
look at it. Right. Yeah. But I can tell you, nodes have to have trees. That is an invariant.
But
I think another thing, if you really like dig down the IL, like they actually have a different like location would actually be for them more interesting. It's like offsets.
yes,
Like getting location information for like diagnostics, like they don't want to print line number. They want to say this method, this offset.
well, so we want to do both actually. We
Yeah.
want to. If I have a PDB, we
Probably
would want to go back to the PDB and say.
So that the
give me a
diagnostic is
sequence
actually
point here and say-
meaningful to the user.
It's a solvable problem. You can produce a well-formed syntax tree
Sure.
or a well-formed location from a bit of IL.
Right, I'm just saying to think about the allocations that this would imply. But you're saying, okay, if they're lazy.
Shouldn't have to allocate anything until you pull on it.
Right, but for everything, of course, I guess for any bound node, there's going to be an allocation per thing, so that's not a problem.
Lots of allocations. Just to
Okay, we're already down here, and there's no savings, you're right, yeah. It's nothing to worry about, as being paranoid.
well, I guess, yeah, let's talk offline about it.
Okay. So there's still this open question. Do we want to have a get location method as well as the syntax property?
I would say if you fake one up and you always have a syntax node, I think it's fine to omit the location. Otherwise, I would expose the location and say, you don't care about syntax, access location. If you do want a special case syntax, feel free to use this thing and make sense of that. I mean, that's to me the only two things that would make sense.
And we know for sure that third-party code can construct syntax trees and nodes and everything. Like we haven't like protected out constructors to make.
No, you cannot.
You cannot
All
today.
of this is theoretical. When we say we can do it, it means we in this room could extend Roslyn to have special case syntax node for a specific scenario.
Right. So
But no,
basically,
it's not currently possible for anybody else to invent their own nodes or trees or.
so like if Nick did his IL work as a hobby project, there'd be no way for him
No way.
to throw or.
So right now it is.
What he could do is he could generate a C# file, parse it,
I was
and then
actually-
grab syntax nodes out of that and hand them back. With
Oh, so you
Just a comment that says not a thing.
With enough stuff in it so it produces the right location.
Actually,
So you can't-
line, no, we could use
Metadata source.
the line number stuff. We can use the pragma line.
You can't create something that's a well-formed syntax node from outside of Roslyn?
You cannot derive your own syntax.
Yeah, that's what I think. I think we have
Construct
the
them.
I think there's like
We have the-
construct.
we have like the internal constructors and protected constructors to keep it.
You can construct C# nodes and DB nodes.
From our factories, but you cannot derive that. No, we've talked about removing that restriction, but right now it remains in place.
That was actually.
Well, that's a problem for this.
That is a problem. And it's also, I was going to ask the question about the versioning of these interfaces. Like, so with respect to, no, seriously, with respect to like right now I've just stood it up on the side, a separate repo, okay? But if these interfaces are going to have the same thing as the symbol interface, which can change, then you kind of, once the IL thing, in order for us to successfully ever productize that, we have to move into Roslyn at some DLL that has.
Crap.
Is it correct? Which is fine, but I just want to make sure that everyone.
The door is open.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. And so yes, these interfaces can change.
So is it a goal for us to have third parties provide an implementation of this?
I think it
No,
is.
but it wasn't the goal for us to have third parties implement the context either.
This disturbs me that they've done this, but
Matt.
I didn't want to make the constructors public.
Well, even if you ignore for a second third party as in like this magic outer entity, right? I mean, as Nick just pointed out, even within Microsoft, if you consider, the F# team part of our team, but they're not working on the same repo necessarily.
Right. That
for the purposes, they are like third parties, right? Because they're versioned at their own rate, and if you add members that break them, that.
Not so much Microsoft versus non-Microsoft as just where we componentize certain things. Like is the IL analysis separate tool, separate toolkit that depends on Roslyn API, or is it another Roslyn feature? Like, does it always have to, you know what I mean? Like, right?
Yeah, versionable interfaces. Figure that one out. And we could have IOperation v2.
No, the only solution we have is we have to be able to potentially version these, and that will potentially break people. And if it's internal and they need to be synchronized to be updated, then they'll be temporarily broken internally.
So does anybody really need to make a decision on that, because we need to go back to, because we need to update the Roslyn Analyzers project, because like today we nuke you if you try to derive from my symbol. Like we issue, because when you take a reference on like Microsoft Code Analysis, we bring in the analyzer and it will fire and say, no, you can't derive from my symbol, you're not us.
Yeah.
If we're going to make that decision for IOperation, we need to make it now so that we can change Roslyn Analyzers in time to get put into the Update 2 release.
I like that. That's good enough.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so
we have, can you put that?
To disable that.
I think you should make it work for any interface defined.
No, I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying if we're going to make that decision, we need to close the loop on it and
I'm
get
just
it
saying
done.
that the tool should make that warning for any interface that's public in the Roslyn namespace. You shouldn't be implementing it.
yeah, okay, that would be a good general purpose feature, because we still have this kind of interfaces, abstract classes and discussions, and most of the issues with interfaces are with the versioning. It would be nice to have a general purpose feature saying like, I own this interface, you can use it, not implement it.
We should talk about that. We actually have this problem in spades with Roslyn right now, where we want to give people, like we want to put code in our assemblies and tell people, no, you can't use it, but it is public. Like it's experimental, you can't derive it, like restrict to use it.
But I can see something like you cannot implement this interface, it's for us. And that would be...
We proposed a internal implementation only attribute in the language design.
So I think I talked to Neil briefly about it. The same with Linear does, right? They have exclusive types that implement interfaces, which is very similar to that. I think it will be a good general purpose thing. It's the same as Proton, right? I mean, like there are some cases where
we can write an analyzer.
They have right now, but it's very specific to Roslyn. Right?
With the circular, though.
So iSymbol is clearly used in here. If syntax node is used and you can't create them, we've then made it very difficult for you to implement these things. I don't want to make it hard for Nick.
Unless we give syntax. They can always...
we can decide that we'll just make a branch and an assembly. I'm going to need internals visible too. I do need to implement symbols. Like, I don't know where, it doesn't matter. If we decide it's only us, then I need the keys. No, I'm serious. Like, that's what it comes down to.
You can implement symbols today.
Actually, you can get symbols.
I do. I suppress the warning. I have a pragma suppress. I don't care right now. I'm just trying to make this.
You don't have to actually implement the symbols. If you're pulling them from IL, you can use Roslyn to.
I do that for the most kept part, but like I can't do it for everything. For example, where do I get the locals of the? Like I take a C# compilation and reference the assembly and use as much of those symbols as I can. But there are some cases where I need to create a label inside the method body. Like that's a symbol, and I need to create a local symbol. Like that's But that could just be that there's a DLL that takes in IL and gives you these, and that DLL, like Microsoft.codeanalysis.c# has the keys, and that could be the design decision. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. If we're saying just one other scenario, we want to add plus IL, or is it we want this to be an abstraction that you can implement from whatever language that you happen to have. Those are two different designs. Is it plus one scenario or plus open-ended?
Yeah.
Yep. It seems like a topic for another day.
The normal school of thought for interface versioning is you never version an interface and you always make a EX or whatever, next version of it. And those work great for APIs that are small and they're not chatty and have lots of different things pointing around to each other and revealing those types.
It'll fall down quickly in this world.
Yeah. So you either have to want a world where it's okay that every line of code that someone writes does a conditional cast to see if this certain extended interface exists on
That is
something
not
or not.
okay.
Or you say people don't implement this interface because it's only for us.
Yeah.
Or it's been proposed that some of these casts and versions could be hidden behind the language in some way.
Well, another thing that we also considered is default implementations of interface members. So you could imagine that you can add a method to an interface, and then the runtime injects a default implementation if it's not provided by the implementer. We toyed with this idea for many years on the CLR teams. It feels like maybe now we have critical mass to kind of push for it and solve this problem for Roslyn and for us.
First solve the basic problems here, and then move on. But I think it's a hard problem in general that we talked about often enough that we should probably start a discussion in more abstract terms.
Right. So we've almost gotten through one interface that has 3 properties and 2 methods.
You can have another cool one.
What are you talking about?
All right, let's look at
Sorry, what did you say on syntax? Are you saying they're keeping it, or?
I basically just wrote down what we said. I think that I don't think we made a decision, but I think we want to talk about that. I mean, that's probably as good as it gets. Should we look at IExpression next, I guess?
Yeah. No, all wrong.
I found myself wanting result type just to be type because I was using it a lot and it seemed long, but
Yeah, is there a reason it's not?
Optional of T-type publicly elsewhere in Roslyn.
Yeah, semantic model.get constant.
That's like the place.
Seemed like returning the same thing made sense.
I remember the type existing, but I can't remember it being public.
Yeah, I result type, if it was just type, that would be shorter.
So is optional, where is optional?
it's in Microsoft.
It's just
It's a public type in Roslyn.
Okay, has it shipped?
Yes. That ship has sailed.
How?
It's like nullable, but you can use it with reference types.
Exactly. We should have it in the framework,
Yes, we should.
the BCL.
Yes.
Talked about
I
that.
forget how that all boiled out when we looked at it at first. I thought we removed it from the API, and then someone put it back.
I think we talked about this, and the fix was let's make it internal for now, and then at some point it was published. That's how they went.
You're talking about optional?
Talked about it before. Let's think at the same time when we productize and we do array, or we don't do array. Okay.
expression statement. That looks good.
Were we going from the top?
So I was curious about. I wasn't sure what the naming conventions were on extensions on interfaces.
Oh yeah, no I there. That's.
So, what was the question?
I was unclear on what the naming conventions are for extension method types that extend interfaces. So it's IExpression extensions. I just don't know if that is.
Use the I. The I is only there to tell you it's an interface. It's not really part of the meaning of the type.
I agree.
Yeah, that should not start with I. Be expression extensions.
There's no I in expression.
It's a Rastafarian class.
Or the operation expression extension.
Yeah, maybe operation expression extensions.
Just operation extension.
Yeah, why
Doesn't matter.
operation extensions and any operation extension could be in that class.
Doesn't really matter. Could have,
Static method that tells you whether it's static. Well, it should just return true. It is static.
It just checks the target. Do we even need this? Like, I guess it's just a helper, right? Like, it just checks if the target of the invocation is static.
Essentially what happened is I started a type that I thought would contain useful helpers, and I seeded it with one thing, and anticipated people would ask for more things. And no one's asked for anything else yet.
He's just saving himself the add new file check-in.
So if we didn't have this, you would have to say, what is it, like invocation.target.
Not aesthetic.
Static.
Is that what it does? I think so.
I don't even remember.
Okay.
So if the suggestion is that we could expunge it, I would probably say.
The method binding expression, John?
Something that turns a method reference into a delegate.
Ah. Yeah, okay.
Delegate should have been named bound method or something.
You want to look at I statement next.
Yeah, I was about to ask, should we walk the expression or should we walk the statement? Because I think these types we don't have much on them.
There's not much, but then we should go to the top.
Oh yeah, statement, that looks good.
Delegate constructor.
So I guess at this point, that's the only 3 types that are meaningful, I suppose, right? So then I guess it's not just walking top to bottom. These are all the kinds. I guess we can skip those. So why do you have separate subkinds? Like, are these literally different, or they're just overlapping?
Subkinds?
Yeah, because like you might say, you can say, your analyzer can say, I want to see binary operations, and binary operation can tell you which one is not the same. It's not just a flat list. Otherwise, like, it would be really painful, right? Because like there's a million of like.
No, there are.
Yeah, and you don't want them like you don't want to register.
I'm not disagreeing
for, like,
with
all
what you said.
users.
I'm just trying to observe. Like, I think in syntax that's what we ended up doing. There's just one syntax kind that represents everything.
Well, there's one syntax kind. No. Actually, there are different syntax kind for every every binary operation, but there's only a single class type for a binary expression.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So but that means basically you need, like, the binary operators are not in a different syntax kind.
That's right.
It's this ginormous long rhythm, right?
Right. However,
I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing. I'm just observing it's a different.
Yeah,
approach.
this probably follows the model that exists in the boundaries, though.
I like.
No, I made it up.
Okay, then.
I rather like it this way, but maybe that's from an implementer's, not a user's perspective.
I ran into, there was a syntax analyzer that I was moving to operation. Syntax analyzer was registering for equals expressions or something.
Uh-huh.
I was trying to find the equal and operation kind. I couldn't, and then I found the binary operation, and then go into that. Right. So if you're moving from syntax, this would be a change.
One thing I did know, there are a handful of places where we do this. Like, this almost gets you to one-to-one between the interfaces and the operation kinds, and then when an interface has subkinds, there are a few cases like for branch, and there's a branch that can be exit and VB or something, or go to, and then those are actually use the operation kind to like distinguish themselves, and then there's like a default value that is like just an operation kind, but otherwise doesn't have a type because it just already has, like, expression already has type. So there were a few. I thought that I liked this model, but I felt that it wasn't, like, it was a bit confusing to me that wasn't like a 100% pattern, that like one interface implies, like, the operation kind is basically which interface to look for, and that any other subclassifications would be, like, I feel like mentally model would be either one flat thing, and then you just understand that it doesn't have to do with what interface it implements, it's the most specific integer to describe the node, or it describes the interface. But the mix I did find confusing, but the hierarchy I found helpful in terms of, but
yeah. To be fair, that's the same thing with syntax. That threw me off because I was first looking for syntax kind of binary. I'm like, what the fuck are the binaries? You must have. Oh, they're specialized. I see.
Could you?
Makes it a bit. I mean, the other question is there's no casting involved, right? As opposed to the binary operator expression would basically have a kind that is typed as binary operation kind, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So,
How do we these binary operators? Because like right now it's alphabetical, but the numbering indicates that we have them listed in a very different order. And I know, for instance, with syntax kind, we are very careful in how we group the members to make it very easy to do classification checks, like is keyword, is operator, things like that. And
also makes the code gen on the switch statement cleaner.
That's the key is it makes, because when we group them into ranges, it meant that doing things like is keyword was we were just like if between these two numbers. It's like it's just a high bound, low bound check. And we ended up having to do things like if you look at syntax kind, everything is grouped and there are large gaps between the group so that we can kind of move forward as we go along. And I guess here, because this tool sorts it alphabetically, I can't tell if we've grouped any of these or left gaps, or if that just doesn't even matter.
Well, actually, there was a grouping, but it's kind of implied and arbitrary. And I kept waiting for someone to ask for some specific groupings, and no one has yet. But conceptually, it seems like a good thing to do.
So actually, do we need this type at all? So at some point a while ago, we decided to cons up a set of fake method symbols for intrinsic operators because that made the IDE code cleaner. If we pretended that there existed operators for all of these things, obviously the IOperation API could just return that method symbol and people could continue to depend on that as the canonical representation of Boolean AND or integer AND.
Yeah, and that would confuse people to no end.
Yeah.
Well, why? I mean, we're using the rest of the symbol API other places.
Say register for invocations. Do I see all these, like every one of these operations? Like I don't want to see those as
what?
Well, there's a method symbol, or you say there's a method symbol?
I'm saying specifically for the binary operations, there are method symbols that exist for all of the binary operations that the IDE uses when they're doing their expand reduce to compare before and afters.
You register for a binary expression, and instead of you get a binary binary expression, but instead of it having a kind, it just has the method.
Wait, you're saying you can register for a specific binary operation?
No.
No, right. So
there's a binary expression or something like that, right?
Correct. So I was
binary operator expression.
What I'm saying, if people are already having to deal with only this type, I don't know if we need the kind. If we could just return the binary operator symbol that we already have.
I thought the symbol was
that seems. I don't know. I want to switch over.
I think to someone who's not a compiler expert, it will baffle them that, like, well, this wasn't a user-defined operator, and how do I figure out that this is adding integers and not floating point? I got to go look at some symbol and figure it out.
Okay, and I guess technically for the IDE's purposes, the reason they use the operators, well, no, because for them it provides consistency, and these are not the compiler writer guys. We used to just give them those pieces, and for them having it fit into the model of method symbols was more valuable, and the way that it shows up in all of the IDE features is as method symbols. And sometimes in the language spec, the way that it's described as method symbols, we perform overload resolution on a set of binary operator overloads, and then we pick one. And
that's what I thought it had the operator, so operator has the method symbol as well. So if you want, you can just get it.
Okay.
Only if it is an actual operator method.
Oh, I see.
Not if it's adding two integers.
So optional.
So why is this binary operation kind instead of kind? Because other places we have like analyzer options.
Because you already inherit from kind rather than EC2.
Well, so there are more than one kind on the node, so they need.
Right. I was looking up. I don't see.
There's a symbol expression. Well, operation has operation kind.
IOperation has.
Oh, that's where I was looking at expression kind. Okay, that makes sense.
Right, so in syntax node we have kind, on iSymbol we have kind. So kind, we just use the name kind for the most general one, but then there's a type kind or a method kind that we have there.
So
could you go back to binary operation kind real quick? Yeah, and also scroll down. Okay, floating integer. All right, so as I recall, in .NET Framework guidelines, we're supposed to use CLR names for things like int32 as opposed to language-specific terms. So should we say integer and float, or should we say single and double and int64? And
I would have said use the language-specific ones because you're the compiler, but given that this is supposed to be language agnostic, I'm probably lean towards the CLI names.
But it's not
Well, we can't use the
necessarily a
names of the
specific
compiler
type, right?
because the two languages
Like,
use
you can
different
do
names.
integer
Well, what you
add
did
on
before is you
one
have
one
tweeted the
integer
same
type.
value.
Like so, so it would be say there's no right. It could be an add of two N64s or two N32s or two shorts.
so
It's,
so
no,
that
it's the
actually
same.
represents-
It's the same kind of expression, right? You don't have to see the arguments to figure out what type they have.
Well, we
Right?
look at the result type.
I see. You only know that it's integer versus, what you said, floating point, not that it's.
Although there is unsigned here, which is helpful for IL, but I was actually a bit surprised that it was there.
Well, you do check versus uncheck. It's the context similar
Well,
to the
if you're doing comparisons, it's necessary.
Go down further. Just.
No, I understand why it's necessary. Oh, I see, but I thought that, like from source, because of the conversion, I thought like if you were coming from source, like you would be able to infer from the operands what like in IL you can't because you just put a thing on the stack and there's a number on the stack. It's not signed or unsigned until you compare it. But you guys are language guys. It's super helpful that there's unsigned, but when would I see that on the high? Like I would see that it will already know.
Yeah, there's if the operands are unsigned, it's an unsigned operation.
Operands? Oh,
Not have unsigned
not
objects.
not
unsigned
checks.
There's only like one less than, right? And the types of the correct or
Right, so you have unsigned int x, comma y.
it doesn't work like that, right? Because you basically have to say check. It's the like it's more like this than like
Right. It's signed and unsigned, not overflow checking the checked and unchecked. I'm mixing my concepts here. Oh, okay.
So checked would be useful too, but
Well, that's a property, hopefully, of the operation itself, not the. Well, yeah. I mean, but.
And this goes to the discussion earlier. I think the question is, what do you represent here? Do you represent the syntax more closely? Do you represent the underlying machinery more?
so
I can see both arguments.
I think it's fine. I do think like I haven't written like, too many analyzers that have had to analyze these, but I do think the grouping would be useful. Like sometimes you want to do something if it's signed or unsigned, or if it's like there's a bunch of equals. Like so, I don't know. You probably do want helpers to say like if you only want to know like are you comparing two things? Give me the two things that you're comparing, kind of thing. Like for equality or something, right? And then you can reason about the.
Imagine
Seems like it might be useful.
It's a binary operation, right? That take is this an equals operation?
Those could be added. Those could be added, right?
Yeah.
So if someone would like to sit down with me, we arrange the grouping of the kinds into the most useful blocks and we assign the values, then great. I've kind of always meant to get to it and haven't.
So that's the node.
It's just be a node.
It's basically Jarvis.
Add extension methods going through.
Extension, I don't know if we need to, like, I mean, that can always come later.
Well, at least set up the value.
Changing the grouping later would be a breaking change.
So that you have that.
That would be, I can imagine that would have value for someone.
Yes.
If we grouped it and had gaps, like I said, it's just something we did with syntax kind, but there was demonstrable value for doing that.
It's a good idea. It's a good thing.
Object VB equals. Is that is and is not, or equals? It is equals. But it's different than regular. Is it dynamic equals?
No, it's just the equals operation applied to operands of type object.
How does that differ from? How does that differ from either the late bound equals or the other equals? Like what are the? How many different equals do we have floating around in here?
A lot of them.
That's a better
Equality is insane.
So what does C# reference equality equals say?
It's here somewhere.
I'd say hopefully it will be there.
Okay, I see. There's a different equals for each type of operands, and only VB can compare. Wait, what?
He has these crazy rules for equals, which will involve things like, oh, this is a string whose value happens to be 3, and this is the number 3, and it will tell you true.
And it will do that for non-late bound equals.
So it's the language intrinsic equal.
And I didn't come up with any other way of capturing the semantics of an equals that would say that the string 3 and the number 3 are equal than to say that's the VB rule.
No, I mean I get it. There is no overlap here between them.
I guess object crazy equals would have been.
It feels more like a dynamic equal, but even still, it's more.
That's a thing.
It's even more defined than like what C# will do with the dynamic equals because of those intrinsic conversions. Yeah. Okay. It's unfortunate though because everyone will miss that case. Everyone will miss it.
So the question is like, how would I? Like, how would I analyze it? Just wants to know whether you wrote A equals B.
What you do is you write a syntax analyzer that looked for equals with A and B.
Yeah, that seems a bit excessive, right?
Equality is extremely crazy.
Man. Okay.
Or we need like a method that goes over all these kinds and fix out all the equals, man. Yeah.
So in the compiler,
Is equals, is add, is.
so in the compiler,
You can also split it up into more enums, like
oh my.
you know, yeah, like type binary.
So
You
in
know,
the
like object is one thing, greater than is another thing. But
Or there
in the
could be one
compiler,
that says equals, and then a whole bunch of properties that tell you what kind of equals it is.
right.
that might be better than doing the multiplication for people if I have to look at those values. Like in the compiler, I think we have an operator kind somewhere in the bound nodes, and I'm assuming that we only have one of those, and it doesn't go into all of this detail because in our implementation, it's more valuable to pivot first on the level of what the operation is, and then get into the nitty-gritty of how you realize that for the specific operand types. Like this looks like it would be a lot of work to ever analyze binary operators to make sure you cover this entire scope. I guess I want to see how this is used because it looks unwieldy right now.
Yeah, we also agree because I mean, if you look at the analyzer, it just wants to know whether you did a comparison between a field and some other field, but you don't care whether you have object VB equals or object equals because unless, I mean,
Int equals.
the crazy rules don't necessarily apply if you compare, let's say, ordinate reference types, right? I mean,
Yeah, the cases that I've written have been things like looking for integer add, and those are easy to get to. But the case you just mentioned seems like a valid.
The one I've written was compare some string to empty. So
Yeah,
just look for string
exactly.
equals, and that's easy.
And nullable equals. You lose what the underlying type of the nullable operation is, but which is probably not relevant most of the time. I don't know.
Fewer kinds, with each kind describing the sort of underlying sort of like whether it's an add or a greater than or whatever.
Right.
And then more information that tells you things about the operands or the semantics of the thing. You like that better.
Yeah.
Or do you even get them right now? Because I mean, I would assume the boundary does what you just said, which is it already has a kind that just represents the operator. It doesn't actually split them out, or do you have the boundary already at the representation where this is all split out? Because that's the thing I don't quite understand.
There probably is some extension methods on it that tells you if it's a floating point or something. I'm not sure. We'd have to look at the implementation, but
And I think it's rather different in the two languages.
wouldn't surprise me.
The split out values are nicer because you can switch over. Like if you have extension methods, then you have to do like if you don't care about the like specific semantics or more information about the type, the operands, you only care about the like general operation. You can't switch over. For example, it's on you have to call these these extension methods or whatever, these extra methods. It could get.
So it's a range that a person has to go through, and they have to look what the actual integer values are so that they can write the actual range in this. Well, I guess in C# you would just list them all out explicitly.
Yeah, exactly. You just do a big switch case and just have all those cases.
Right.
It's just very tedious, right? It's very easy to omit one and not seeing it.
Yes.
Bad.
It almost sounds like subkind kind of thing, right? Where if you don't care about the details.
That's why we have, for the syntax ones, we have syntax facts and we have questions like, is this a token? Is this a
whatever. So they're just one big flat list, but then there's several helpers.
I think for those it works very well, but I mean, because you rarely switch over those. But as Nick said, like it's easy to say, I want to just switch on the operator, right? I don't care about the details.
I would go for 2 enums. I mean, if that was the case, I would go for one for the operator kind, that's the high level thing, and then the detail about the operands either be
operand
kind, and then maybe 2 flags for checked and nullable or something like that. And I think that would get
maybe.
I think it's that's just the language.
A lot of types.
Well, the VB thing is just the language.
I will have to spend some time sitting in my office staring at it to know all out. But
Okay.
Argument kind?
In our remaining 13 minutes.
pretty clearly, we're not going to cover everything.
We want to maybe just look at the walkers then, if we've looked at the visitors.
Like those are just a pattern, whereas there might be more.
Yeah, so I think right now the walkers, the I prefix should also be removed.
Did we add the parent?
Oh, okay, good. Never mind then.
Get parent kind of a thing, did we add that? Get
Parent operator.
Given a operation doing
What is its parent operation?
we don't have any functionality.
We don't have it.
You have to navigate to the syntax, go to its parent, and go back down, and maybe that would help. Maybe that would work.
It'd be expensive, right? Because you have to walk from.
But there are no parent pointers in the bound trace.
If we had something that was already walking in and kept the pointers, then you ask it and it just gives you.
Oh, I'm sleeping fine. My wife keeps waking up.
So you have IOperation. You have statement operations. Oh, I see.
F-months.
What is a type operation expression?
Is that a
It
typo?
has the word operation in there again.
Size of or type of.
Yeah.
I think I would split those out.
What does that mean?
So yeah, that the overlap between those concepts, it's not clear that it's worth having a unified node for that. And a lot of times in the syntax tree, we had like something that represented 3 different things that people didn't think of as very connected, and we just split it out to 3 different syntax nodes. And I think type of and size of might have been one of them. We had primary expressions.
Interestingly enough, so what does I type operation have? It has the kind, and then that's it, and then it has a type. Oh, type operation. I see.
So it's an operation that takes a type as its operand.
And it probably should just be called type.
No, it can't be typed, but because the I expression already said we want to have that be.
Oh, it's because when you take the size of, you get an integer back. So you have 2 different types. The size.
Maybe I would just call it operand because then it's kind of like clear.
Is there any value in having just
Your suggestion is size of, I size of, I type of.
yes,
The same shape.
just split them out like that. Unless there's some analyzer people can see where they would hit both of those cases with the same analysis.
In which case you just register both. I mean, it's not hard.
And I think the discrimination is already in the kind. I think the size of already are
Actually,
separate
is
kinds.
this type going to be different from I expression dot type? It would be the same thing, right? Be the same type symbol. Do we even need those?
Size of.
Oh, size of what return? Size of
something
return.
is something
It'll be an
else.
integer.
But there is also a default value of, which doesn't have, which is just an expression with the kind.
Oh, default of T. The default of T is not here.
It's not. I'm just saying, like, I got a little confused, like just a little confused on these ones, like where to find them. Because type operation didn't mean much to me,
Right.
and I was trying to figure out how to do default of T. I was looking for an interface, and I realized there is no interface because the only thing that it has is the type. So it's just an expression with kind is default value, which is fine. It took me a second. Like now that I get it. So just some feedback that I found that a bit hard to find.
So should type of be like that as well? Because the only thing it'll have is the type, which is already on I expression.
No, it's not. The result type of type of is
a
type,
type,
is system.type.
Yeah.
The type that it's operating on is not its result type.
Ah, yes, it's a type operand. Is there a I default type thingy?
There's not. There's a kind operation kind default value.
Right. What is the
Unlike these two, it doesn't have a type operand. The result type is also
right? What is the interface for a default expression?
it's IOperation, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
What?
There is no, it's just a node of type I expression.
It's just the base expression.
Is there other cases where there's nodes that only have IOexpression as their interface?
Oh.
I found that one hard to find.
So it's reminding me of in the syntax tree rules, it's like there are roots and there's some abstracts, but there's real things only are leaves in the tree. And so are there cases here in this tree where actual bound nodes end up not reflecting a leaf of one of this type hierarchy, but are like that example fully representative of things in the middle of the hierarchy?
The stop statement passes the opcode that says I'm stop.
Right. In that case, we would still want to wastefully throw out an interface, doing whatever we have to.
Interface with no members.
Yeah.
That would be better, just because.
Also, if the bound trees don't look like that, you're going to end up being expensive, right? Because you're going to end up having to allocate an object on the side to implement a specific interface. So I'm just saying,
if your program has 1 million stop statements, we'll pay a little bit on it, but it probably won't. And even if there's one node right now that represents stop and in, that can just be 2 different nodes. It's only going to be one of those at a time. The problem is that if you're writing a visitor, it's not clear to the user.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have to override visit expression. But visit expression won't visit all of the expressions. It will only visit the default expressions or these expressions. If I want to visit other expressions, I override their methods. And we had that, we very adamantly avoided that.
So specific empty interfaces are a good thing.
Yes.
Yes. There should never be a visit method that visits an interior node. The visits should always hit leaf nodes.
Okay. There are certainly some number of them that are present. I didn't know that.
Oh, it's an unwritten rule. We had a design meeting where we had to decide whether it was a rule, and someone said, "Well, it wasn't, but it's a good rule. We should have that." That's how that came to be.
Same is true for expression, right? What was it, default or whatever?
Yeah, expression is used today for default of T.
We'll also take some notes here.
So
I think we're almost out of time.
So do we need to do this again?
I think so.
Yeah. We've only looked at about 5% of the surface area.
That's true, but I mean, just to keep in mind, when we did the original Rolsyn review, we did more or less the same thing, because I mean, once you have a few key design principles, it's just rinse and repeat across across the board. Also, the question is, if we find 3 more tiny issues somewhere, is it the best bang for the buck, or is the time we just spent on finding the big design principles more useful for everybody? But I'm fine with doing the exercise again if there's some big error that we missed. Like you already mentioned the visitors, right?
So while you're just one nit that I keep coming up against is the labeled and the labeled. Something we want to use.
I labeled and I labeled.
I hate this.
So what's the difference? Because I don't know.
In Visual Basic, there is a label statement, and it's just a statement by itself. It has nothing else. In C#, there is a different representation, which is a labeled statement that has statement as a child. I know that's the case in the syntax nodes.
Somehow
it's in the bound nodes too.
Somehow these things should be pounded together into one thing, and every time I look at it, I look at it for 10 minutes and I get pissed off and go do something else.
Why couldn't the labeled statement? You should have a label end statement.
Right. I think we might have had an empty statement. In C#, can you just have label colon and just nothing else?
Semicolon.
I see. So yes, in C# syntactically, we require a statement, and that's why it's a labeled statement in the syntax tree.
But at this level, if I'm running an analyzer, that
You
would be
really
the thing
don't
I-
want to see two
I-
different things.
Right. I just wanted like you had to like that's a C# ism. At this level, there should only be one way to represent.
Right.
But if it has two statements, what's the syntax node going to be?
Let's just
It'd be
write
the
down
first label statement and then the next
first one is
statement.
labeled, right? I guess. Then the next one is just after it.
Right.
No, I mean, this operations syntax node. If we have like a ILabel statement, which has the label, and then the next statement, which is the labeled statement, then if I say ILabel statement dot syntax, what do I get?
Oh my.
welcome to my world.
Get an answer. That's what you get.
So maybe the suggestion then.
They need to be mashed together into one thing, one way or another.
Now, in the bound nodes, do we also have just a generic synthesized? We have synthesized labels, obviously. I don't know if we have synthesized label statements or labeled statements.
Didn't encounter any synthesized label at the highest level.
Okay. Just make a note to look at this more, and we can go and stare at it until something hits us. Something could be math.
But I think it's better to have a representation that is somewhat awkward and only have one of them than to have two different precise ones.
So here's a case in point on the versioning thing. Right now there's an is expression, which I'm assuming is the C# type check is. But when we start talking about pattern matching and extending the is operator, then we would change this interface and break anybody that tried to implement it. And people will probably try to mock this up because unit testing, yay.
Really? That seems very hard for me. Like, I mean, the analysis context I can see because I don't have to mock that much, but am I really likely to mock the entire tree here to unit test my analyzer? It seems like a lot of...
Not the tree, but like how does it handle my synthesize? I just make up some lambda. Does it do the right things? I guess it's easy enough to just make up syntax.
Exactly. I would just write the freaking source of C# and like unit test the rest. And then,
Okay. Yeah, that works.
The context emerge is just like the arguments to your analyzer.
yeah.
The spelling of the literal expression?
Yeah, I have that question.
Literal expression, maybe just literal.
Well,
Well, no, I mean this.
literally the text that was in there. If the literal was 0007, just say text.
Well, how is that not the syntax? I mean, you can get that from the syntax.
Good, but what you usually want is the value of the literal, which you get from the constant value property. But if you're going to produce an error message for it or something, this is how the thing was spelled in the text. And since each language has its own rules about how to convert the literal to its value, we don't want to try and canonicalize the thing.
Right. I get that. I'm saying why. Is it so valuable that we don't want the user to just go and grab the syntax itself and defer to its text?
So, lock statement, my expression locked. Should property names just be nouns?
It should probably be lock object or something.
Yeah, lock object.
Locked expression.
Locked expression.
If you say locked expression,
I like it, like-
instance expression, like look at every other operand expression. Like the problem is the code so far is extremely consistent and not using an expression suffix with fields. And as soon as you put properties, as soon as you put it on one,
The parent of the lock
Right.
statement, right?
I think we should be
There's
consistent.
a term for
I
that.
agree we should be consistent.
I actually like I lean towards having like locked expression personally, but at the same time, the fact that it's extremely consistent as it is makes me like, yeah.
Right. If we were going to go with locked expression, then we would have to revisit most of the other cases.
I think locked object is a fine term.
Locked object.
Yeah,
Let's make it.
So thrown, what about
Target.
same thing for
Thrown,
thrown,
I guess,
thrown,
yeah.
thrown object?
Thrown object.
What about using statement? Is that the used object? Used it.
There are things like if has like then, or what does it have? Like,
So where it was thrown, I got see it.
I remember thrown I don't know.
oh no, I thrown expression. I just did it from my I throw statement. Sorry. I just happen to remember that as a thrown.
So in
And like I would look at if statement too. Then anyways, is this a general thing? It has to be a noun always. Like
No, I mean there's a lunch thing immediately.
I kind of liked it the way it was shorter, not that unclear.
I mean, there is a rule that says property should be nouns.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
so
Just
to me, locked just especially. I mean, it sounds like a
Boolean. Or something.
Boolean. Yeah, it's like, is it locked, right?
Okay.
Quite frankly, I wouldn't even mind instance, because in the context of all of this, it's pretty clear what instance you're referring to, right?
what terminology would you use?
The one you lock, the one you whatever,
Would
right?
you use for using?
Using
The using statement. What is it?
use
Body.
Or
body.
No, the operand of the
Yeah, what's that?
Operand of the using statement. Yeah.
wrong kind of.
the
Oh, I see.
right.
Oh, using the declaration, I guess.
That would be dope.
Oh well, then we. Oh, using with declaration. Okay, variables. Okay, but using can just use with expression. There we go. Value. Okay.
What is I using with declaration? Is it a BB thingy or is that a C# thing?
If you say using name equals value, then you're declaring a variable. Right, when you're declaring you're naming the value you're capturing, as opposed to just using the result of
Using var x equals new stream reader as opposed to using new stream reader.
Visitor doesn't get like so. We said we should never visit interior nodes, so I don't have an easy way to just say like to handle all the three together in a visitor. Like, seems a bit much. Maybe they should just be like optionals. For one thing, I don't know.
Sorry, I'm confused.
I was just wondering, maybe I'm wrong, but would it be easier just like to be say like, well, if it's a declaration, like could these be optional, like the value? I see. No, I get the difference. So they're like exclusive from each other. I was gonna say.
This one seems odd, by the way. You say variables, and then the thing that you're referring to only has variables.
It has
Variables, not variables.
yes.
It seems a bit odd. Maybe that should be declaration. The top one, declaration dot variables, because variables are variables is something weird.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So we can have the using statement that has a list of declarations, which may be 0, and.
So guys, I love talking to you, but I want to have lunch, and it's like 12:04, and it doesn't seem like we can just wrap up the rest here. So
Right, there will be another thread to pull on for a while, so thank you.
yeah, thanks a bunch. It was super interesting.
Thanks.
Thanks for the guys. Oh no, there's still 5 viewers. Sorry guys, but I want lunch. See you guys.